Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and finance. This week, trouble in paradise. We look at Jamaica's silent crisis, a nation sinking in debt. Can it survive without more loans? With all the focus on Europe these days, will the international community forgive the island's debts? Also this week, the European nation that preached austerity measures to its southern neighbours but can't walk the talk. We're in the Netherlands. As a property boom takes down one bank, will others follow? And how drought and a ban on exports is taking its toll on Australia's cattle farmers, an industry in crisis hoping elections will bring a new hope. With the way the world's gone in the last few years, you'd be forgiven for thinking that debt is almost exclusively a Eurozone problem. Not so. In fact, some of the most indebted nations in the world are actually across the Atlantic in the Caribbean. With little chance of contagion, it's escaped international attention. In fact, the International Monetary Fund's called it a silent debt crisis. And so the lender of last resort has stepped in to bail out Jamaica with $1 billion. Let's break this down for you. Jamaica's debt to GDP ratio amounts to almost 150%. And though not as high as Jamaica, other Caribbean nations have been suffering from similarly dangerous debt levels. The debt burden for these countries is amongst the highest in the world. They're using as much as 41% of their revenue to pay off debt. Jamaica itself uses 33% just to pay the interest on its foreign debts. Every year, that's $1.2 billion gone on debt repayments. And is any decent amount of money actually coming in? No. Growth remains stagnant in the Caribbean, so there's little hope nations will ever unload their huge debt mountains without some debt forgiveness. But none of this is new for Jamaica. You see, it's sought a bailout in all but 1 year between 1972 and 1995, 22 years. And the lack of growth, combined with the growing debt pile, means the people are suffering. The Caribbean has high unemployment rates, increasing poverty levels, and according to a recent IMF report, has simply been getting poorer over recent decades. So what else could it possibly do? Well, let's look at that. Jamaica and some other countries in the Caribbean, actually. We're going to do that with Gerard Johnson. He is the General Manager for the Caribbean Department at the Inter-American Development Bank. And I was interested, Gerard, to see in your notes that Jamaica actually went through what was considered one of the biggest banking bailouts in the world back in the 1990s. Is it almost that things haven't actually recovered since then, that they, never found their footing again?
Well, I think if you're talking just about Jamaica, well, as you know, it's not just a Jamaican issue. It's something that's affecting many countries in the Caribbean. But if talking about Jamaica, the basic problem is growth. If a country is not growing, then the kind of problems that you're seeing, that's what results of a debt that you just can't grow out of it. If you're not growing out of it, well, then it just keeps mounting and it ends up feeding on itself and then stifling growth.
So are we looking at bad money management then? The idea that Jamaica and other countries have kept borrowing money but not, as you've pointed out, had enough growth to even think about, paying off those debts, let alone actually getting into the black and starting to grow the economy properly?
Well, I would say that there's something very important about Jamaica to be taken into account. Jamaica pays its bills. The bailout in the 90s wasn't Jamaica reneging on commitments. It was Jamaica doing the opposite, ensuring that the banks, several went out of business, but the financial sector survived. Because of support from the government. So it's actually the opposite. In Jamaica's constitution, there is a provision that makes servicing of the debt a national priority. So it's not a matter of Jamaica not paying, it's a matter of the debt growing so big that it consumes over, or used to, until the restructuring, it was consuming over half of the government's revenue. Essentially, it's a matter of survival. Unless these countries grow, belt tightening on its own isn't going to be a solution. Getting poorer and poorer going into the future doesn't work for many politicians or for many countries as a growth path or as a development path. In other words, fiscal compression on its own isn't going to solve the problem.
Which perfectly preempts what I was going to say next. Going for more loans is not going to help, but from the way you talk, it doesn't seem like the growth prospects are very good either. So what do Caribbean countries do then? It seems tourism's probably the most important thing in the region, but aside from that, what can they do to grow their economies, change things in and bring in the right money?
Well, it's a very well located region in terms of transshipment. Tourism, in terms of trade, the things that the Caribbean does, and of course, it's oversimplifying things to say the Caribbean. We're talking about the English-speaking Caribbean. Of course, you've got huge countries like the Dominican Republic that are Caribbean, Cuba. So we're really talking about the really small states. But even then, there are two groups. You have the commodity-rich countries, Suriname, Guyana, Trinidad and Tobago in the south, and then you've got small islands that basically rely on, of course, those in the south have aluminium, gold, lumber, the possibility of hydro, and then you get to the small islands where it's a totally different reality, and post-independence, or in the post-colonial era, the tourism industry has been huge. It's the most tourism-reliant region in the world. But there are other things. The Philippines, India have been very, very successful in back office business, call centers, serving the United States in a totally different time zone, different language, different culture. The Caribbean has a natural advantage in that area. In a country of 100,000 people, it doesn't take too many industries to get a boost. Really what's needed is to open to new things and to give up sacred cows.
Gerard, you are from the Inter-American Development Bank. I guess development is the key word there. You're not in the mindset of bailouts and and loans and such. So tell me, what are you doing, to develop a country, to make it more self-sufficient? Talk us through some of the things you're doing in the Caribbean.
Well, the big G, the big thing is growth, and that is it's not just in the Caribbean, it's not just a matter of doing what we do now better. And the model is broken. The way of doing business that took us from independence in the 60s to middle income status to doing quite well isn't working anymore. We are working very, very hard on a new initiative. The goal is a flight a day out of Sao Paulo into 4 destinations in the Caribbean. Aruba, which is not part of one of our borrowing member countries, managed to leverage 3 flights out of Brazil, and that was enough to turn their economy around. When you're talking about a very small economy, something like that is a game changer. We don't crowd out the private sector. If the private sector is willing to finance infrastructure, that's better. Often they're not. So what we're also bringing is experience from around the region. Many countries in Latin America have done very, very well with PPPs, public-private partnerships. For example, a highway where in Jamaica we joined with other financing agencies in providing financing to an international company to build the highway, charge the tolls, and the government didn't have to increase its debt for that infrastructure to be put in place. So that kind of a model. These are examples of things that we're doing. Of course, there are others.
Gerard Johnson from the Inter-American Development Bank. A pleasure talking to you. Thank you for your time. And still ahead on Counting the Cost, the world's largest exporter of beef, crippled by drought, a strong dollar and an export ban. Just who's looking out for the farmers of Australia? We'll look at that a little later on. So we've discussed debt in the Caribbean this week, but the usual debt dramas of Europe need some attention too. In particular, the AAA rated nation that waved a big austerity stick at its southern neighbours, but now finds itself in trouble. The Netherlands is in recession as property prices slump and unemployment rises, problems which stem from lending during the boom years. It has one of the highest levels of household debt in the world, about 266%, mostly in mortgages. And its banks have the highest level of mortgage loans in the Eurozone. The government was even forced to nationalise the country's fourth largest lender. And unemployment, it's doubled over its past 2 years, reaching 8.1% in March. But as ever, the fallout could be an opportunity for some. Emma Hayward takes a look at one family business that's finding it easier to recruit in these tough times.
The Simonis family has been in the fish business since the end of the 19th century. And Albert has been running his restaurant and shop for about 30 years. Business is good and his customers keep coming back. He's kept prices low. But each time he advertises for new staff, he's reminded that the economy in the Netherlands is struggling.
In 1980 and 1990 and 2000, it was very hard for us to get people to work. And at this moment, it's very easy to have people to work. For example, my son put yesterday something on Facebook asking for people, and he had 500 people who want to work here.
The Netherlands is still in recession. Figures show that almost 8% of the workforce is unemployed. Here in the Netherlands, unemployment isn't at the rate that it is in countries like Spain or Greece, but it has been steadily rising, and there are fears that that could become a pattern. Consumer confidence has fallen here. The Dutch have been exposed to the euro crisis and housing prices have suffered. And the Netherlands might be about to break a rule it's been a big supporter of, the EU pact which says the budget deficit mustn't exceed more than 3% of the country's output. The government is also delaying some austerity measures, hoping the economy may pick up in the second half of the year. Some say the attitude towards the EU is changing.
We have been loyal during the past years where we were expected to support countries like Greece, but we are much more pragmatic than we were in the past and more careful because we have also a very critical public opinion.
The government here is taking something of a gamble. If the plans don't work out, the Dutch in the short and the long term could find themselves with less and less to spend.
To Australia and an industry in crisis. Cattle farmers have been hit by, well, two things. One is the recurring problem of drought, but also cases of animal cruelty abroad, which have led to a temporary ban on some live exports. They say the government's not doing anything about it, which is why farmers are pinning their hopes on a coming national election to perhaps bring some relief. Andrew Thomas's report is from Richmond in Western Queensland, and just a warning, it does contain some graphic images.
In northern Australia, farmers are hurting. There's a drought and their animals have little to eat. But there's worse. There are more cows here than there should be because the export of many has ground to a halt. Shocking video of animal abuse abroad is part of the reason why. We're only using snapshots of a cow being stabbed in the eyes, of another having its head half severed before it's hung upside down, still kicking. These pictures were taken in an abattoir in Egypt. Because the cattle started their lives in Australia, exports to Egypt from there have been suspended. For Australia, it's happened before. Last year, revulsion at similar practices in slaughterhouses in Indonesia led to Australia's government banning exports there. Though that ban's been lifted, Indonesia's government was offended and retaliated by imposing a quota on cattle imports. Australia's exports are barely half what they were a few years ago, and a high Australian dollar makes finding new export markets hard.
Probably a reduction of up to 50% in values of cattle, yeah, which is pretty hard to cope with.
Politician Bob Katter, a former cattleman himself, describes what's happening as a crisis. He's independent of the main political parties. His constituency in the outback is bigger than France, and his people are hurting.
We have a farmer committing suicide every 4 days. A lot of cynicism out there. They've thrown the towel in, nothing can be done, there's no point in fighting.
Katter's flown to a cattle crisis summit. The farmers here want financial assistance to help them through the dry weather, a lower Australian dollar and the full resumption of live cattle exports. Bob Katter could be their best hope. In Australia's cities, he's dismissed as the mad Katter, a protectionist, nationalist and socially conservative eccentric. But out here, he's wildly popular. He hopes to win enough seats in September's national election to give his newly formed party the balance of power in Canberra.
We will use that power with ruthless brutality. Let there be no doubt about that.
Despite its image as a country of glitzy cities and large mines, a big chunk of Australia's economy is based in the dusty interior on agriculture. Farmers would like to grow that further to become the food bowl of Asia, but that will take a political will they say is lacking. For them, September's election is about reminding what they call Metro Australia that they matter too.
Now, the thing that makes the world go round. Usually you just say money, but we're specifically talking trade here. And the very idea that trading our way out of the global economic downturn, particularly the jobs slump, might be a whole lot more effective than simply austerity or stimulus. Here's a way to illustrate it. Some numbers from the global courier company UPS, which says it shifts 2% of the world's GDP every day and 6% of the GDP of the United States every day. How does that translate into something tangible for the everyday person looking for a job? Well, UPS has calculated that every 22 packages it shifts equates to one full-time job at the company. Now, this sort of thing was discussed recently here in Doha at a meeting of the International Chamber of Commerce. It's trying to kickstart the infamous Doha Round, a negotiation started by the World Trade Organization 12 years ago here in Qatar. It aimed to bring down barriers and increase global trade, but that round still hasn't been concluded. And the Chairman and Secretary General of the Chamber, who stopped by our studio for a chat, both think the impetus lies with business.
It's businesses are saying we're in a crisis, and it's not governments that are going to create the jobs that are going to get us out of this. It is business that's capable of doing it, but you've got to, in fact, unleash the power of business to invest.
But then are we getting into this sort of vicious circle situation, almost chicken and egg sort of thing, where business wants to do something, but the conditions aren't perhaps conducive towards good business at the moment? You know, the austerity decisions which economies and governments take, they're stifling business in many ways, and yet you guys are saying business has got to be the driver of growth.
No, but you know, as we are very pragmatic, we are not pressing the governments to take all the decisions which were envisaged. To be very precise, there is an aspect, what we call the trade facilitation agreement, which will reduce by half the cost of logistics and customs.
So this is like that actual physical stuff across borders, and making it easier.
With the Peterson Institute of Washington, we have calculated that only this could create 20 million jobs around the world, or at least preserve and create 20 million jobs. And that's not a small figure.
No, of course not.
And paradoxically, this trade facilitation agreement was agreed by the whole 157 countries, member states of the World Trade Organization. But there was a bylaw of WTO, if all is not agreed, nothing is agreed. It's a key priority for the business.
Okay, so there...
And you know, the question of an answer to why is Doha stalled. I mean, I was here in Doha when at the ministerial that launched this.
2001.
And it was really considered to be a watershed, because this was the first round, you know, in all the 60-year history of the evolution of the GATT and the WTO, first round that really said, we're going to open the door to developing countries. We want to bring them into the trading system, and that will be, you know, the best way to, in fact, ensure that their living standards continue to rise. So it was a very hopeful moment. But, you know, the world then proceeded to divide. India, Brazil, Turkey, Argentina, etc. Suddenly became not developing, but they emerged, and they're now world powers.
Powers, exactly.
You know, and so the world went this way. There was reactions to that within the WTO, and I think it's also one of the reasons why you see reactions. You know, some of the reaction is that countries began to disengage at the multilateral level. So you see the blockage in the climate change negotiations, frustrating, you know, rounds of ambassadors sitting around not coming to any conclusion, because the political will is not there to do it by these governments. So
let me stop on that point, because that's one thing I wanted to bring up with something Gerhard mentioned earlier. You've got all these ideas, the trade facilitation idea is there, and the governments are receptive to that sort of thing. Broadly, though, are governments going to listen to business? Do you feel they will actually listen? Because, you know, look at somewhere like the UK at the moment, where the austerity measures that are put in place are very unpopular, and yet the British government won't move on that, even though business, particularly saying we need help, this is stifling us. You could argue the governments aren't listening. You've got all these great ideas. You take it to a Bali meeting of WTO. You take it to a G20 meeting. Are they going to listen to you?
They seem to understand, which means that we are not raising issues which are out of the scope of the governments. We should focus on practical things which interest business. And it's true that in some other aspects of the life, business and government cannot reach agreement. But on what we focus on, there is hope. At least there is much more hope if the business expresses its voice than if it doesn't do.
Right, so it's expressing its voice. Is it ready to act, though? We were talking.
I think a crisis concentrates the mind, and when you're at the precipice, and for many governments, you've got levels of unemployment which are extremely high and worrying. I mean, socially, creating situations of instability potentially. There's an obsession in China, in India, in all the major economies, in Brazil, to continue to create employment and raise standards of living for the millions that are coming onto the markets all the time. I mean, India is looking at 500 million young people coming onto the markets in the next few years. They know they have to educate them, they have to find employment for those people, and if they don't, it's potentially disastrous for that country. The crisis again means that they may be looking a little more attentively at what business is saying, because business has the means to be able to intervene.
There is a Bali conference for WTO in December, which means that we have a real deadline. And I think that the political leaders look for avenues for growth and jobs creation. If also we demonstrate that business has a consciousness of social responsibility, because, as you know, the man in the street thinks that globalization is against their countries, which is not the case. I mentioned the Peterson report, but we also have to do some efforts to mention the fact that there is no contradiction between what we try to obtain and the interest of the people.
Well, it looks like the next in line could be China. From Iceland, Tim Friend has this report.
The Arctic summer sea ice is melting and the Chinese are coming, whether the countries in the polar region like it or not. Huge reserves of gas, oil, rare earths and uranium lie here. And under international shipping law, any vessel has the right to be in these waters. For countries like Iceland, it presents a huge challenge: how to manage the increased exploration and trade and preserve the environment.
We have the obligation to, watch out for the nature in the area. There will not be oil spills, there will not be contamination and so forth. So it's not just a question of having new opportunity, it's also a question about the responsibilities that we have to the area, and not just now, but also for the future.
Iceland's president has called for an expanded role for China and other Asian countries in the future of the Arctic, as global warming has effects far beyond the region. For shipping companies, it's created huge opportunities. The newly navigable northern sea route above Russia cuts the distance between Shanghai and northern Europe by 6,500 kilometres, with big cost reductions.
We have seen vessels, there are vessels calling this or sailing this route now, but this is developing every year, and the people are following this, and we hope that we can see some real cargo moving there in the near future.
There's an irony to this, because although the new routes are being opened up by global warming, the shipping companies say that because they're shorter, there will be fewer emissions in future. But environmentalists remain concerned. Some international analysts say that China's economic interest in the region could have military or security implications. Beijing has never announced an official Arctic policy. Its embassy in Iceland said that no one was available for interview.
And that's our show for this week, but there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/business. There you'll find the latest business headlines. Also, a link to the Counting the Cost page where you can watch this or any of our previous episodes again. And then when you want to get in touch, you can just tweet me at Kamal AJE, our business editor at Abid Oliver Ali, or drop us an old-fashioned email, countingthecost@aljazeera.net. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.